Good morning and welcome to our fifth class on lessons from the rivers of the Bible. Today will be the first of three lessons on the Jordan River, and no river is more central to Israel's history than the Jordan. It has basically served as the nation's eastern border since the children of Israel crossed into the Promised Land, which is part of today's lesson. But I want to begin with reading part of our text from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 48 through 52. As the children of Israel were camped in the valley opposite Beth Peor, in what was known as Moab. Then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, Go up to this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho. View the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel as a possession, and die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people, because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. Yet you shall see the land before you, though you shall not go there, into the land which I am giving to the children of Israel. Moses spent the first 80 years of his life in preparation for leading the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage and into the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. He has spent the last 40 years leading the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness due to their rebellion and stubbornness. His spokesman and brother Aaron is dead, a death first recorded in Numbers 20 and verse 28. Now Moses receives his punishment for his sin at Meribah Kadesh. The Lord allows his servant Moses to gaze into the promised land from atop Mount Nebo, but will not be permitted to cross over the Jordan with those he has led for 40 years. Kadesh was an important place for the Israelites. The 12 spies were sent out from here, and Miriam died and was buried here. As recorded in Numbers 20, Moses committed the trespass that banned him from crossing the Jordan at Meribah Kadesh. Here the Israelites found themselves without water for the congregation. So let's read verses 7 through 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. The water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. In his frustration and anger with the people, Moses struck the rock twice with his rod instead of speaking to the rock. Nevertheless, the water flowed to the satisfaction of the people, but Moses was punished for disobeying God. While it may seem a little harsh, we must remember that Moses' punishment was not eternal. The glorified Moses will appear with Elijah and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17, and the parallel accounts of Mark 9 and Luke 9. Aaron met his fate shortly after the children of Israel left Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. He died there because he and Moses rebelled against the Lord's word at Meribah, Numbers 20 and verse 24. Perhaps as leaders, the Lord made examples of them and punished them accordingly. We won't take time to read the final chapter of Deuteronomy, which records the death of Moses, but I want to point out that he was allowed to view the promised land from the top of Mount Pisgah. He then died there in the land of Moab at the age of 120. And the Lord buried him in a valley opposite Beth Peor, but the location of his grave was never known. The children of Israel mourned for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Before transitioning to Joshua's leadership and crossing the Jordan, I want us to read the final 3 verses in the book of Deuteronomy. But since then there is not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Moses will be forever known as the lawgiver, and is recorded as the humblest man to have ever lived except for Jesus. I want to backtrack just a moment to Deuteronomy 3, verses 23 through 27, and catch a glimpse of a Moses eager to cross over the Jordan. Then I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do anything like your works and your mighty deeds? I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains in Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, Enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift your eyes toward the west, the north, the south, and the east. Behold it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. Moses pushed the limit sometimes in his conversations with the Lord, and I find this last occasion revealing. It is time to hand the reins over to Joshua, who's been in training under Moses for the past 40 years. I won't focus on the leadership transition, but I do want to examine the crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. As we open the book of Joshua, the Lord speaks to Joshua and reaffirms his need to obey the book of law and all his commands. Joshua then gives orders to have the people prepare for crossing over the Jordan in 3 days. In the 2nd chapter, Joshua sends out 2 spies to reconnoiter the land, especially Jericho. You'll recall how Rahab hid the spies with the assurance she would be spared when the Israelites took the city if she kept it secret. The timeline gets a little fuzzy from Joshua's original order involving 3 days, and the spies' time in Jericho and then hiding in the mountain. Nevertheless, as chapter 3 begins, Joshua and the Israelites depart from their campsite at Acacia Grove and move to the Jordan River, where they will lodge until they cross over. At this point, we get snapshots of how the children of Israel will cross over. First, they will follow the lead of the Levitical priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant. They will follow at a minimum distance of 2,000 cubits, or about a half a mile, which probably allowed for better visibility of the Lord's abiding presence between the cherubim. Secondly, the people were commanded to sanctify themselves because of what the Lord would do on the following day. You may recall that the people were told to do the same thing before the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, according to Exodus chapter 19. Now notice the words of the Lord after the priests began moving with the ark. Joshua 3, verses 7 and 8. And the Lord said to Joshua, This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You shall command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant, saying, When you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan. Crossing the Jordan will be so significant as it begins the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham centuries before. This miraculous crossing will also replicate the crossing of the Red Sea 40 years earlier. It will also establish Joshua as the new leader of Israel after 40 years with Moses as the head. So let's read the ending of Joshua 3, beginning with verse 14. So it was, when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priest who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came from upstream stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaretan. So the waters that went down from the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priest who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on the dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. Just a couple of side notes before we comment on the text itself. One is that the flow of the Jordan River is a lot less today than in Joshua's day due to irrigation and other needs. Adam is supposedly about 18 miles north of the Dead or Salt Sea and is just south of where the Jabbok River flows into the Jordan. Also, crossing over near Adam would have been much easier at any time than at Jericho. And this only magnifies the greatness of God's miracle that day. The command by Joshua to the priest to take up the ark and begin crossing over the river was given in verse 6. But now the movement begins. So it was when the people set out or broke camp as Joshua had instructed them to do in verse 3, and followed the priest bearing the ark. The waters of the Jordan stopped flowing when the feet of the priest dipped into the edge of the water. Adding to the suspense of this epic moment, the narrator informs his readers that this is the flooding season of the Jordan, as it overflows all its banks, and it does so during the whole time of the harvest during the spring. Richard Hess writes in his commentary on Joshua that when the Jordan River was at flood stage, it would be, and I quote, wider than its normal width of 90 to 100 feet and deeper than its average 3 to 10 feet, end of quote. And the flow is described as turbulent. The text also explains that the waters of the Jordan were stopped upstream at a place called Adam and stood in a heap. The remaining waters flowing into the Sea of the Arabah, or the Salt Sea, failed as they were cut off. The people then crossed over opposite Jericho. The priest bearing the ark stood in the middle of the Jordan on dry ground, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground. And it seems significant that the last time this Hebrew word for dry ground was used was in Exodus 14 and verse 21, in connection with the crossing of the Red Sea. God's people did not have to slosh through the mud on either occasion, adding to the miraculous power exhibited by God both times. One addendum to this miraculous event was that the Lord had instructed Joshua to have one man from each tribe pick up a stone from the dry Jordan riverbed and carry it on his shoulder to their camping place that evening, to Gilgal. The priest continued to stand in the middle of the Jordan until these stones had been removed. Then Joshua commanded the priest to come up from the Jordan. Notice Joshua 4 and verse 18. And it came to pass when the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet touched the dry land, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. What a day in the history of Israel as God miraculously delivers the children of Israel into the promised land. They crossed the Jordan River at flood stage on dry land just as they had crossed the Red Sea 40 years before. Moses, the lawgiver and their leader for 40 years in the wilderness, did not get to enter the land of Canaan. However, he's been replaced by Joshua, who has just led them across the Jordan. So notice Joshua 4 and verse 14. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. While there's so much more we could say about the crossing of the Jordan, I want us to end this lesson by reading the final verses of Joshua 4 and the meaning of the 12 stones removed from the Jordan. So let's begin in verse 19. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, When your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What are these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Israel's history was a story of God's continual deliverance, and the crossing of the Jordan was but a segment. However, the Lord wanted his story passed on to succeeding generations. The 12 stones at Gilgal told that story for a while, but now they're gone. Thankfully, the Holy Spirit has left us a record of these miraculous events to pass on to our children. Thank you for joining our class today. And looking forward to next week as Randall will talk about the Kishon River from the book of Judges.